All right, welcome everyone to the Smooth Brain Society. Today we have Dr. Tirta Susilo. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, cool. He is a senior lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington and is on to talk about his work with regards to perception, in particular face blindness. Um, as always, we have a co-host. Today, joining us again is Farrell Badiani. She was on in our religion podcast a few episodes ago. So welcome back, Farrell, and welcome Tirta to the podcast. Awesome. So we'll just start where we start with every guest. And if you could give us a little bit of a background into how you got into your field of research, why you find this so fascinating. So a little bit about background for our listeners.
Yeah. So I'll probably backtrack a little bit more because I stumbled uh, onto psychology, onto science, really. So I grew up in Indonesia, born and bred, and I had no idea that one day I will make a living out of teaching and researching. So my undergraduate major in Indonesia was industrial engineering. And I wasn't really a good student at the time. I was goofing around. I had other priorities, but I did well enough, so I graduated, and then I tried out the real world. I worked in manufacturing and corporate finance for about a year. It didn't work out, so I didn't know what to do with my life. And so I remember one day I was going to a bookshop, and I saw How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker. And so I don't know, the title caught me at the time. I tried to read it. I didn't really understand it, but I thought, hey, studying how the mind works sounds cool. And so I decided to go back to uni and study again, this time in Australia. So I went to Australia actually to did a 1 year degree in psychology, and I did well enough, and I got offered an honors scholarship, so I took it up, and I worked with this woman, Valerie Stone, in Queensland, who is an evolutionary psychologist, actually. So at the time, she was doing all sorts of projects, one of which was on face perception, and uh, and that was the only project on offer because I was the last student to arrive. It's like, this is the project you're going to work on. It's like, okay, I'll do it. So, and that brought me into the world of face perception and vision, kind of more generally. And then I continued with the PhD, staying with the same topic, learning more and more about face perception, psychophysics, experimental psychology, a bit of neuroscience. And in the last year of my PhD, there was this student in the department who had face blindness. And so, as my supervisor, Eleanor McCone, and myself ended up studying her, and we wrote a case report about her, and that brought me into the world of face blindness, which has remained with me ever since. So, yeah, that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but that's the that's the true story.
Nice. So then, what is face blindness for those who don't know?
Yeah. So face blindness is also known as prosopagnosia. So that's a mouthful. Prosopagnosia. It's a Greek word. Prosopon means faces, and agnosia means lack of knowledge or not knowing. So prosopagnosia or face blindness is a condition whereby someone is unable to recognize familiar faces. So faces that you've seen before, faces of family members, close friends, and this is unlike the occasional failure of face recognition that we all experience from time to time, right? So we see people on the street, it's like, oh, I can't really recognize the person, or I can't put a name on it. It's nothing like that. This is much more severe, and it happens frequently, even to faces that they're supposed to know because they interact with these faces all the time.
Yeah, super interesting. Um, what I found really interesting in your introduction was you mentioned you worked in the field of evolutionary psychology briefly. So I
Hmm.
wanted to know, what are the evolutionary underpinnings to face blindness? And if that is something that you've researched.
Yeah. So I guess face blindness and face recognition more generally, I think, is one of the research areas, I suppose, in visual perception that has attracted some evolutionary psychologists. And the reason is there seems to be specialized visual mechanisms that are used for faces, but not for recognizing other stimuli. And, at the time, there's a lot of, this is about 20, 30, 40 years ago, there's a lot of debates and discussions concerning, the variety of cognitive mechanisms that are, that our species, I suppose, inherited from our ancestors way back when. And, face mechanisms seem like a good candidate for it, given how critical faces are for survival, and all that. So that, to me, I mean, that kind of brings in kind of the two sides of the equation, where you have evolutionary biology, and also visual perception and disorders in the case of face blindness.
Cool. So then you mentioned that we seem to have a particular, what do you say, interest in, evolutionary interest in, what do you say, perceiving faces. So does that manifest biologically as well? So in the brain, do you see any differences in how people perceive faces versus other
Yeah,
things?
yeah, of course. So there's a network of kind of regions across the occipital and the temporal lobe that seem to be specialized for face processing. So if you use fMRI and you look at how these regions react when people see pictures of faces as opposed to controlled stimuli, these regions would respond much more strongly to faces. And this is also true in other primates. So macaque monkey is a great model for studying face processing, because their visual system is very similar to that of humans, and they also have these areas across their kind of occipital temporal lobe, which contains cells. So these are individual neurons that are highly selective to faces.
How do you experiment on these things? So what kind of research models do you actually use when you're trying to study face blindness?
Yeah, so myself, I run mostly behavioral experiments. So I work with human participants who report having trouble recognizing faces. So I work with them. I give them kind of our standard battery for face blindness to see whether they meet the kind of the threshold for prosopagnosia, and if they do, I invite them to sit on a bunch of experiments, right? So one of my last experiments is on the distinction between the processing of facial identity and processing of facial expression. So faces are important because we not only use faces to recognize who people are, but we want to know what they're feeling, what they're attending to, right? So there are all kinds of social information that we extract from faces. And I guess one of the key questions in prosopagnosia is whether the impairments impact only the processing of identity, so I don't know who you are, or does it also extend to the processing of other information from the face, right? So I ran a couple of behavioral studies looking at whether identity and expression processing can be dissociated. But other researchers, they use all kinds of tools. The imaging is a popular one. You want to see whether the network of face regions. There's about a dozen of these areas. On both hemispheres, whether they specialize in these different aspects of face processing. Maybe some areas are more specialized for identity processing, other areas for expression, for instance. In the monkey, of course, you could insert electrodes, right? And you could do single neuron or single cell recording. And so you could go down a level and characterize, how face processing works at the level of a single cell, and, kind of march through and see, what happens in this area. It seems to be kind of activated earlier because it's located, closer to the back of the brain versus kind of another area that seems to be activated later. So if you think about it, if the whole network is it's like a factory where you have an assembly of processing, right? So what happens at the first stage and the second stage, and so on. So there's a variety of methods that we use, and I think for the most part the results converge, which is good. I guess when you're doing, mind and brain sciences, you want as many lines of evidence as possible going in the same direction.
Really, really interesting. So can you shed some light on your findings, or what are some of the costs, both evolutionary and current costs of face blindness? What is it that you have found through your research? It'll be super
Yeah.
cool to hear about.
By cost, do you mean like what, how does it impact people who have it?
Absolutely,
Yeah. Yeah.
both in the long term
Yes.
as a species, and then both as present as an individual. If you know the answer to both.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, I think I guess the immediate cost is, prosopagnosia can be socially crippling, right? If you can't recognize people from their faces, then that you're at you have a big downside in terms of how you socially interact with people. So people who have prosopagnosia usually try to come up with other routes to recognizing other people, so they pay more attention to your voice, for example, right? So if they, when they first meet you and say, "Hey, you're a feral," and they pay close attention to how you speak and your mannerisms, right, and your hairstyle, your glasses, right, and they remember, okay, I met this woman feral in Victoria, right? So when I see somebody like her on campus, I can use that contextual information. So that's the best they can do, but sometimes these cues they fall short, and they just don't work if they happen to bump into you in a grocery store without context, and you change your hairstyle, and they'd be like, "I'm sorry, I had no idea who you are," until you start speaking. And so many people have that we've worked with have reported all sorts of downsides, in terms of well-being, in terms of limited work opportunities. You can imagine certain areas of or sectors where you have to interact with a lot of people, and you kind of have to keep track of who's who, and that would be difficult for them. And the one common, I guess, anecdote that almost everybody with prosopagnosia mentions is that they often lost the plot when watching certain TV shows and movies. Especially those, I don't know, like, where you have a war movie with 10 soldiers, all the kind of same style, same haircut, and and they don't like which character does what, and they just like, okay, there's no way for me to make sense of this. In terms of evolution, I'm not quite sure, actually. I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about how prosopagnosia can persist, right? Assuming that it's been around for a long time. I guess current estimates of the prevalence is about 1 to 2%, depending on where you draw the statistical line, and so maybe that is still within kind of the sweet spot where you have certain conditions that can go on generations by generations without disrupting the kind of the whole balance of the population. So, but there is. I suppose I mentioned about monkey being a good model right before, and one, I think, difference that is often noted when we talk about human face recognition and monkey face recognition is that human face recognition seems to be more specialized for recognizing identities, just because we've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of faces, not directly, but through magazines, TVs and things like that. Whereas for monkeys, I think they don't see that many. They live in small groups, so their face recognition is probably more specialized for tracking expression changes, right? So micro, oh, he's sort of like angry there. I picked it up. I want to go away. I don't want to get near him because it'd be awful or something like this. So maybe these systems, they're kind of similar in many ways, but they've been kind of shaped, I suppose, slightly differently through evolution and also cultural demands, right? That are different for the different species.
So, uh, based on that, how does prosopagnosia come about? So, is it genetic, or due to injuries, or what's the reason?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So there are two types of prosopagnosia. For a long time, we thought prosopagnosia is acquired, right? So which means people used to be able to recognize faces, and then they suffered some brain damage, and then they lose their ability to recognize faces. And it's noticeable because I know I used to be able to do this thing, and now it's different. I can't do it anymore, right? So that for a long time, those are the only prosopagnosia cases that were reported in the literature, beginning in the 40s, I think. But in the last 20, 25 years, we've learned a lot about the other type of prosopagnosia, which is lifelong. So this is known as developmental prosopagnosia or congenital prosopagnosia. So people who have it, they've never been able to recognize faces. So for as long as they can remember, they always have trouble, even in childhood. So you imagine, you go to school and like everybody looks kind of unfamiliar, and then you go home and you try to find your parents, and kind of you run to the wrong adult, and kind of there are stories like that which are kind of comical, but actually it's quite sad because people used to think, oh, these kids, they just don't get it. Maybe they have some learning disabilities, but it's not learning disabilities. This is a very specific visual recognition disorder that they're having. So the more common prosopagnosia is the lifelong one. That's the one that is estimated to impact about 1 in 50 people to varying degrees. So has severity, of course. Not everybody has severe prosopagnosia. Some people have kind of milder version or moderate version.
Yeah, you bringing up learning disabilities is interesting because I was just thinking that if you're having, because of a lack of face perception, if you're having issues with social interaction, it can easily be seen as other social interaction deficit disorders,
Yes.
like autism
Yes.
or something.
Yes. Yeah, and we know prosopagnosia is not the same, or is not caused by autism, right? So there's a couple of papers now. In fact, my latest paper is about that. So we look at a population of people with ASD, and we managed to dissociate their face recognition difficulties from difficulties that are experienced by people with prosopagnosia. So there's a couple of reports now dissociating autism from prosopagnosia. But early on, like when the early reports about prosopagnosia started to appear, people had the kind of natural suspicion that maybe this is just a consequence of people not being socially adept, right? So maybe they're not paying attention to faces in the environment. So of course, if you don't pay attention, then you're not going to recognize people. What's so hard about that? But now we know that it's not due to lack of social attention or social motivation. It's not due to general memory problems, right? So it's not just that people can't remember anything semantic about other people, and also it's not a general visual disorder, because most people with prosopagnosia can read just fine. They can see colors, they can recognize objects, they can navigate the environment, and so on. So it seems to be a very specific form of visual recognition problems. I should say visual agnosia. I guess that's sometimes people think prosopagnosia is a selective type of visual agnosia. So visual agnosia is a broader term whereby some people, mostly due to injury, have problems recognizing any objects at all, right? So they can see, they can tell you that something is moving, and what's moving is a red dot or something like that. But once you start presenting them with kind of more complex stimuli, like you show them a picture of a car or something, and they say like, I have no idea what that is. I can tell you it's kind of blue. It has a curvy part here and there. The right side is bigger than the left part, but I don't know what it is. But then if you ask them, like, do you know what a car is for? Forget about the picture. And they say, oh, yeah, it's for driving. I have a car at home. So it's not that they don't know what a car is for. They don't lose their semantic knowledge about cars. And if you play them the sound of a car, they can tell you it's a car, right? So they can recognize a car through a non-visual route. It's just a visual pathway for recognition is gone. So that's the case with people who have visual agnosia. Now, prosopagnosia is like that, but just for faces, more selective. Yeah.
I had a two-parted question.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them build on what you said previously.
Yep.
One, which is, have you found any evidence for facial blindness? Because I cannot say the Greek word.
Yes.
Does it impact the ability to read emotions? Has it impacted that? And my second question is, you mentioned there being possible cultural differences and cultural pressures. Are there cultural differences that you have recorded or know about that affect, facial blindness or even visual agnosia?
Yeah. So those are both really good questions. So the first question, a minority of people with prosopagnosia have some trouble with expressions, but to a much lesser extent compared to their trouble with identity. Most people who have prosopagnosia have no trouble recognizing expressions. So suggesting that, in our brain, there seems to be specialized mechanisms for processing facial identity that are separate from mechanisms for recognizing facial expressions, right? So the second question is about cultural pressures. Specific pressures I'm not aware of. I mean, as far as we know, prosopagnosia is present everywhere around the globe. But it's interesting when you start talking about cultural variations, because in the face recognition literature, there's a well-known finding, which is called the own race bias, or the other race effect. You guys probably can imagine what it is. So if you grew up among faces that have a similar structure, let's say I grew up in Indonesia, around me they're all Asian faces, right? So my visual system is pretty good at discriminating between Asian faces. And then I moved to Australia, and suddenly my visual diet changes. Now there's a bunch of Caucasian faces around me, and Caucasian faces, they differ in ways that Asian faces are not. So take one example: eye color, right? So their eye color, well, this could be blue, it could be green. Well, I no idea. My visual system's never used to do this, where it had to discriminate faces based on eye color. So I had to kind of learn that when I arrived in Australia, and it took me a couple of months until I'm okay. Now I can tell that these two, white faces, these are different people, as opposed to just one person that I keep conflating. And so that phenomenon can interact with prosopagnosia, right? So it could be, it could actually add to your prosopagnosia. We already have trouble recognizing faces, and now the faces are of different ethnicities and races, right? And they differ in terms of the features and so on, that you could have a double problem right there.
I just wanted to quickly ask, so when Caucasian people are like, all Asian people look the same, is that not racist?
Maybe. Well, I mean, there's about two answers probably. I mean, some of them maybe. I mean, but I think there's a visual perception answer to that, whereby they're just being truthful. They say, well, you guys all look alike, just because I'm not used to, seeing and learning to discriminate between your faces. I'm not using the right features or dimensions, in the kind of your face space that are optimal for discriminating between the faces. So you really look alike. I'm not just I'm not pretending that you look the same. You really look the same as far as my visual system is concerned. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Taking that one step further, then, if I looked at a particular object or particular variations of the same object again and again and again, or if there was enough of a diet for it, just like enough of a diet of Asian faces per se, would my processing of those change in the brain as well? Would I have a new location specifically for that or something?
Yeah. So this is a question about visual expertise, right? So some people develop certain experience with a particular class of objects. If you're a bird expert, for example, then you spend days on ends, right, just watching birds and telling them apart and so on. And so the question is, what happens to your visual system when you do this? And there are changes. So there's a part of the brain that seems to be more malleable and is adaptable for gaining expertise with visual objects that you have a lot of exposure to, but these are separate from the areas that are sensitive for faces, right? So way back when, people debate about whether these are the same areas, and so the face areas are there just because we see faces a lot since day one, right? So maybe faces are not special, it's just because we have a lot of exposure to them, they look special, but it doesn't. I think it's safe to say now that doesn't seem to be true. I think there's something special about faces, maybe the geometry, maybe the evolutionary significance. I mean, who knows what, that we can dissociate in the brain, faces versus these other objects of expertise. One class of categories that is obviously different from faces is words and letters, right? I mean, we all had to learn to read when we were young, right? So prior to learning to read, there's no region in the brain that is specialized for letters and words. But once we become an expert reader, we have what's called a visual word form area, which is located on the kind of left side of the brain, about a blueberry size region, I think, just tucked behind your ear, and that area seems really specialized for processing words and letters. Once you know how to read, of course.
Well, in in that case, you also mentioned, I remember, different levels of processing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so do people who have prosopagnosia or any sort of kind of object blindness as well,
Mm-hmm.
can they tell that like something's there or
Yeah.
something's wrong in an experimental condition or in real life? So you said that they seem to be better at detecting emotions without seeing a face. So can they kind of vaguely tell
Yeah,
what's going
yeah.
on, or
So
how does
this
it
is
work?
kind of the kind of the first question people ask. Like, so if you have face blindness, what do you actually see when you look at a face, right? Uh, so they see the face. It's not like they're seeing a black hole or something like that. So sometimes the term face blindness can be misleading. So because they're not blind to the face, they see a face. But I guess the best illustration would be, and this is many people who have prosopagnosia, they say this. Uh, my experience seeing faces is probably like your experience seeing faces when it's flipped upside down. So imagine looking at a face upside down, right? You still know it's a face, all the visual information is there, but suddenly you lose access to much of the social information. It's hard to recognize the person. You're not sure what expression is shown. You're not sure, where the eye gaze is looking and all that. So they could tell you they're looking at a face. If they go slowly over the picture, they can tell you, oh, the nose is kind of bigger than average. The left ear is asymmetric compared to the right ear, and so on. But all these different features, different parts of the face, they don't add up, and they don't come as a whole to give you that impression of the identity of the person or the expression that the person is showing. So that's probably the best way for people who don't have prosopagnosia to imagine what it's like when you have it.
This may be, sorry,
Yeah, no, go ahead.
this may be like a sillier question, but then how do people with facial blindness manage to have social relations like friends and even romantic relations like, like partners? So how is it that is navigated?
Yeah, so it's tricky, like I said before. But again, I think I mentioned that prosopagnosia comes in different severity, right? Different levels. So if you have most people have a mild or moderate prosopagnosia, which means that they can still recognize their partner, for example, or their spouse, but not people that they just met. For example, newly learned faces would be difficult, but faces that they see again and again and again would be okay with that. So I think that could help to some extent with kind of personal relationship, and kind of, as long as your social circle is small, small enough that you can manage it. But once it grows, then you have you have problems. But people with a more severe prosopagnosia, yeah, they really have a hard time. They just have to navigate the world without faces, so to speak, right? They can't even recognize themselves, some of them. So when they brush their teeth in the morning, they look at their face in the mirror. They can't recognize the face.
That's
Of course,
insane.
it's they know it's them because they're standing in there. But you're looking at a face, and it's like, this face looks like an unfamiliar face, even though it's your face and you've seen it so many times, right? So that's uncanny. I mean, I don't know how to imagine that. It's kind of like, this is just like a face, a random face that you see when you open a magazine or something. There you go, that's a face.
That's
So
wild.
yeah, it's wild.
Wild.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, go ahead.
so can you tell us a little bit more about the case study that you had done with the PhD student? Was it when you just introduced yourself? How severe was her
Oh
facial
yeah, for
blindness?
her, yes. So she hers was quite severe, and I think in that study we were interested in looking at this uh, mechanism of face recognition, which I touched upon earlier, which we call kind of whole face processing.
Hmm.
So it turns out with typical people, when we look at a face, we tend to process them as wholes, right? So you look at a face, it's not like you go through, okay, I'm going to recognize Farrell now. I'm going to start with the left eye and then move to the nose. People don't do that. They look at your face, they take a snapshot, and they say, that's Farrell, right? They get it. So they analyze the whole face as sort of like a one unit, one stimulus, right? So we wanted to see whether her prosopagnosia can be explained by impairments of that process, whether she was unable to perceive and process faces as wholes. And I think we found some good evidence of that. So it turns out that she relied more on kind of separate parts of the face when she tried to recognize the face. So if she lucked into a distinctive part of the face that gives away the identity, then she would be able to recognize the person. But as you can imagine, that method of recognizing people is probably not robust, so yeah. So she had a tough time, I think, socially speaking. But people come up with ingenious ways. So one of the probably more famous people who have prosopagnosia is Oliver Sacks. Have you guys know about Oliver Sacks? No, so he's
Yep.
a famous. He passed away now, but he's a famous neurologist, and he wrote a lot of books about his wild cases, people with all kinds of interesting cognitive profiles. He himself had a lifelong prosopagnosia. And so when he used to host parties in his whatever New York apartment or something, but when he invited his guests, he told them to wear name tags. So, which I thought it was that's a smart way. So that way you can just you can just tell who's who with the recognizing. And I've heard from many prosopagnosics we work with that that's their strategy. That is to be open with people and say, hey, sorry, I have this condition, and so if I don't recognize you next time we meet, it's not because I don't care about you. I'm not paying attention. It's just I have a visual shortcomings as far as face recognition goes.
For those who don't know, one of his famous books is "Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat."
Oh, I've heard about that book.
Yes, so that's
Yeah,
Oliver Sacks. Yes, so that's the author. I think he that's probably his most famous book, "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat." And then, I mean, he wrote, I don't know, a dozen of books, or probably more. But I think there's one book that is called The Mind's Eye, I think. And in that book, there's a chapter about face blindness. And he told his own story, living with it and failing to recognize his own face in a mirror. So, yeah, he had a severe one. He had a severe type of prosopagnosia.
Well, we're talking about not being able to process faces. Can I ask about the flip side, where you kind of see faces in everyday objects and things like that?
Yeah.
Where does that come into the whole processing spectrum?
Yeah. Yes. So that's the that's a one word answer to it. So there are two flip sides. So, and one is like you said, our tendency to see faces when there's none, and the other is there are people who are actually have the opposite of prosopagnosia. So people who are called the super recognizers. So these are people who are really, really good at recognizing faces. Right, so I'll talk about that a bit later. But because your question is about seeing illusory faces, right? So I think the experience is called pareidolia or something, where you have this experience of seeing, faces in Mars, faces in the clouds and things like that. So so I guess one answer is that again, faces are important. If we think about it in evolution terms, you if you want to make an error, it's better that you have a false alarm of thinking a face is there rather than not detecting a real face when it's there, right? So I think it makes sense in terms of the cost benefit to build a system that is super sensitive to detecting face-like features in the environment, and that seems to be what happens. So in the last 5 to 10 years, I think there's been a surge of studies looking at whether processing of illusory faces are similar to processing of real faces, and for the most part, I think the answer is yes. So these illusory faces seem also to be processed as wholes, right, rather than by parts. If you put people in the scanner again and you show them pictures of illusory faces, the same regions that are specialized for faces would light up as well. That said, there are some differences as well. So I'm actually currently working with with my old master's student, Lizzie, writing a paper, and where we shows that there, despite these similarities, illusory faces are not as effective as real faces in capturing our attention. So we use a sort of like a visual search task where you have like 12 images on a screen. They're just pop randomly in different places, and you're supposed to locate if there's a face there as soon as you can, something like that, right? And people are really good when the face is a real face, right? They find the face faster than if the target was a butterfly or a flower or whatever else. But when you show them illusory faces, they're not as good as they are with real faces. They're still better than compared to butterflies and flowers, right? But the advantage conferred by illusory faces is not as obvious as the advantage given by real faces. So there are some differences there, but we're still trying to clarify the picture here.
Fun fact:
Yes.
a byproduct of seeing faces in things, even illusory faces, is why one assumes that we can see God and ghosts and stuff like that. It's a byproduct of why we are religious.
Yes. It's closely related to how we attribute minds when they don't exist,
Absolutely.
right? Yes, because minds and faces are closely intertwined, and it's really interesting. Again, I mean, there are studies looking at what features in the face make us attribute minds, right? Because you could imagine a face of a doll, and then feels like, well, that's a doll, and I don't want to attribute minds in there, but that's a face of a real human. And where is that kind of threshold if you kind of morph a doll's face to a human's face, right? At what point we start to attribute, okay, now there's agency there. This is we can assign things, we can assign blame, we can reward and praise. So that's kind of, I guess, one flip side. The other flip side, as I mentioned before, is the super recognizer. So this is really interesting because in the last 20 years, people have started looking at individual differences in face recognition. So we used to think that with face recognition, you either have it or you don't. But it turns out that there's a significant variability of face recognition skills in the population. So that is to say, us three here, our face recognition skills are probably not the same. You guys will probably have better skills than mine because mine's not good. But kind of most people are kind of average. Some people are better, others are worse, right? And some people are really, really bad at it. These are people with lifelong prosopagnosia, and some people are really, really good at it. And these are the super recognizers. So people with super recognition, they really they really have amazing abilities with faces. They see a face once and they say like, oh, that I saw you in that shop, by the university like 3.5 years ago, and you're doing this and that. And people's like, what? It can sound creepy, like you're just like, what's going on with this person? And again, it's not a general or superior memory skills, right? So they tested people who compete in memory championships. I think there are these things where you're supposed to remember as many things as possible as in as many formats as available. And these people are not good when it comes to faces. So you can dissociate superior ability in face recognition from superior ability in remembering things more generally. And the supers have been put to good use, I think, in London, in Berlin. I think they work with the police officers, forensic examiners. You can imagine this because sometimes you have to identify people from bad CCTV images, and but the supers are doing a good job with these stimuli.
That's so cool. Um, I remember growing up, one of my mother's coworkers, he worked in the genetics department as well because my mom's a geneticist, and he would see a child or any patient walk in, and based on how they walked in, he could say, "Oh, they have this gene mutation, and it's this version of this mutation."
Oh, wow.
And I know it's not exactly the same as just recognizing faces, but it was just this uncanny ability of walking down the street,
Yes.
And him just seeing someone and being like, okay, they have this mutation because you can see their lip curved this way. And you're like, what?
Yeah. People have different, kind of cognitive sensitivities to different things. I mean, we call them all geniuses, right? But geniuses come in many flavors. And going back to my, I guess there was a question early on about evolution, and I talk about face recognition having, sort of like a set of specialized mechanisms in the brain. It's probably not that surprising if then some of these mechanisms approach kind of the genius threshold, right? And some people are really, really good at it, just like some people are really good with math, for example. And on the opposite side, you have dyscalculia, right, which is the inability to work with numbers, which is quite specific again. And so I didn't mention this at the beginning, but some people, when they think about prosopagnosia, they they think of it as one of the kind of selective, I guess, cognitive uh, disorders or deficits. I mean, the others being, I mentioned dyscalculia, but there's also dyslexia, which is probably the most well known, right? And then there's amusia, so people who can't perceive music, as we call them, tone deaf. But it's quite specific. Again, it's not because they have general learning disabilities or bad memory or bad auditory system. It's not all that. It's very specific to music. There's topographic nausea. So it's a mouthful. So people who get lost all the time. So these are people who can't form kind of a mental map of the environment, right? So when they navigate the environment, they tend to rely on landmarks, right? So I see that building. When I see that building, I turn left. But they actually have no idea about where left is relative to right and whatever. So if you ask them to close your eyes and imagine, okay, now you're here. Imagine going that way and that way. How do you get from the School of Psychology to the hub or something? They'd be like, I don't know. Nothing comes up. And the most recent one is probably aphantasia. It's on the news recently. Aphantasia is the inability to imagine things visually, the inability to come up with pictures in mind, right? So, and say, if you close your eyes, can you bring up a picture of this? They say, no, it's blank. Nothing. Wow. If anything visual for me has to be seen. The stimulus has to be in front of me. If I close my eyes, I don't imagine anything. I don't even know what that question means. Kind of like, what do you mean imagining things? Like, okay, just quite wild again.
That's really interesting, because I was talking to like some of my friends, and I asked, because it's so wild to me that I always have like a running monologue or vision of something going on in my head. Yes. And I met someone, I was like, so what do you do? Like, how do you think of things? And then that person was like, I don't. I just feel them. And I'm like, I don't understand what you mean.
Yeah. I guess so much so for naive realism, right? I mean, this all of these kind of attest to our different phenomenologies. I mean, we experience the world differently, right? So when we say something is green, well, that thing's not actually green. That thing just reflects certain wavelengths that are processed by our visual system, and we interpret as green. And these different conditions, I can bring home that point more clearly by saying, what do you mean by visualizing things? You visualize it, I don't.
Absolutely.
So so aphantasia is received a great research interest, and people want to know what it is, and do you have it for non-visual modalities? Like people have inner dialogue, inner monologue. So you talk,
absolutely.
And some people don't have it. So like it's all very fascinating. Still many unknowns.
That's so fascinating. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned at what point do you kind of identify consciousness, right? From a doll to a human. Isn't that term called the uncanny valley effect? Is that what it is? Or is that something different?
Yeah. So it's uncanny valley. I think it's been around for a while. I think it was first coined by a Japanese researcher way back when. But I think the evidence, or the results so far, is they're probably more mixed than people think. So sometimes it's not clear where the uncanny valley is, or what features of a face give rise to the uncanny valley. But I suppose the uncanny valley, when it was originally coined, I think it refers more to this kind of uncanny feeling that something is, I don't know, something negative at some point, right? Where you transition from a non-human face to a human face, where you feel a bit, maybe even grotesque, like you feel like you want to move away from the stimulus. There are other studies that have failed to replicate the uncanny valley, mainly that you can morph a doll's face to a human face, and at no point in that spectrum that you experience any uncanniness whatsoever. But you still have a point where you start to, okay, that's where I would start to attribute minds, where the face comes alive, so to speak, as opposed to just it's a robot's face or a doll's face or a mannequin's face or like that. Yes.
And for the last part, because I know you have to leave, can we talk a little bit about the neurological side of it? So in the sense, what kind of activity goes on in the brain in all these things? So is there different activity patterns when in prosopagnosia, Nosex versus I want to say people
Yeah,
normal on the
controls,
spectrum.
typical controls, right? Yeah, yeah. With acquired prosopagnosia, it's clear because usually you have an injury to one of these face regions, right? And so you clearly see the region's no longer there. With lifelong prosopagnosia, there are subtle differences, but only when you do large group studies. You have to kind of bring in 50 people with prosopagnosia and 50 without, and you average the results, and then you can see, okay, both groups still have these dozens of areas, but the prosopagnosics, they show weaker activations overall. Or maybe the different areas in the network are underconnected. So they're not talking to each other as much as they do in controls, for instance, right? So you can find these kind of subtle differences, but I wouldn't go as far as saying that we have found a biomarker for prosopagnosia, which I think is also true with other you know conditions, right? With autism and
Yeah,
other
yeah,
people
yeah.
have been hunting for these biomarkers for ages, but it's always very tricky. The most promising results are usually results that stay at the group level, right? We say, okay, on average there might be some differences, but you cannot you know find a robust marker that can be applied to a single brain and you say, okay, this person must have it or this person must not. I think we're not there yet, I suppose.
Just to build on that, I had a quick question about supers. Do
Yep.
they have a different brain structure?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not a
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
neuroscience person. That's the word.
Yes, neuroscientist. Yes, and as far as we can tell, no. So they have the same set of areas in the brain. They have a similar visual system. Uh, in some cases, there seems to be overactivations to some extent, but it's not clear. So we really can't explain why they have the ability that they do. Uh, and so yeah, more research needs to be done. But we know that their ability is real because I think it's been really documented.
Yeah.
And you can give them really really tough face recognition tests and they can crack them. And I guess suffice it to say that it's harder to if you're if you want to fake your way, right? It's easier to fake your way into having prosopagnosia, right? I'm just going to press random buttons and pretend I can't recognize faces. But if you want to show a superior ability, you can't fake your way. You kind of have to really know what you're doing. And so with the supers, I think there are some cases who are really, really solid in the sense that these people really can see things that we cannot uh, with faces.
Yeah, really cool. I like that you guys call them supers, like superheroes almost.
Well, it's a super what do you call that? Almost like a superhero ability in a sense, right? Because you could do things that most mortals can't do, right? Given the same picture of faces, you can tell, oh, these two people are the same, and they are. Whereas for most of us, like, there's no way these two pictures show the same person, but they can tell you that.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're really good. Did I answer your question about brains and neurons here, or was that the?
Ye- yeah, yeah, mostly. I guess one more thing on the same lines would be we hear often about top down and bottom up processing.
Mhm.
So kind of getting visual information in
Yeah.
and uh, being able and to so from getting information
Mhm.
into being able to perceive
Yes.
something
Yes.
based on what you know.
Yes.
So
Yes.
where do most of these issues fall in
Mhm.
when it comes to it? Is this more a processing issue or
Yeah.
is this more the second part of
Yeah, of the
like a
kind of
top
the
down
connection.
issue?
I think it's probably the same. I mean, this is an old issue, as you can imagine. So going back to before prosopagnosia, people have long known about visual agnosia, right? So this is the general problems recognizing objects, and there are two types of visual agnosia. So one is kind of more perceptual. I think it's called apperceptive agnosia. So people who have apperceptive agnosia, they can't even create a good perceptual representation of the stimulus in front of them, right? So the sensory input is coming in, but it's not being processed properly. And so the evidence is that if you ask them to copy a drawing, let's say, they just look at this and it's here, you just have to produce exactly the same thing next door. They can't do it, right? The other type of agnosia is called associative agnosia. So associative agnosia seems to be rooted in later stage processes. So after you create a good representation of what you see, you still have to connect that representation with knowledge, right? With what you know that, okay, so I'm seeing a car right there because I know what a car looks like. And so people who have associative agnosia, they would be able to copy a drawing of a car, but then they wouldn't be able to tell you that that's a car that they're copying. Right? They just like, okay, I see the curvy bit on the left, I'm producing it here. There's a rectangle over here, which is the window, for example, and they just draw the rectangle right there. But then they say like, okay, so what is that object that you just copied? I don't, no idea. I don't know idea. So that, and I think the same distinction can be made for prosopagnosia. So some people report difficulties just even describing or creating a good image in their mind's eye, about the face that is in front of them. Others probably have trouble associating the perceptor, associating the face that they're currently holding in their mind's eye with their prior memory and knowledge about that face, if they've seen that face before.
Awesome. So can I ask what kind of projects you're currently doing, and what's your current research like, and what do you plan on doing in the future?
Yeah, there's a couple of lines of work. So one is looking at kind of the more perceptual aspects of prosopagnosia, and this is because there's some recent data suggesting that most prosopagnosics, so we used to think that prosopagnosia is more about associating, right? So more about recognition memory problems where they just can't remember people's faces. But I think there's some intriguing data recently suggesting that the problems might be earlier than that. The problems might be in problems problem perceiving faces rather than associating faces. And so if you give them tasks like, you show them two faces side by side, right? And you say, are these two faces the same or not? So you don't ask them to learn the face or remember them for later testing, nothing like that. Everything is on the screen, and they just have to discriminate between these stimuli. They have problems with that. So we think maybe prosopagnosia is more of a perceptual disorder than people think. So we're currently looking into that to see what perceptual aspects are impaired and how so, and so on. Another line of research looks at potential strategies for improving face recognition in prosopagnosia. So some groups have worked on this for a while, but it's a tricky issue. So most studies, they're on, I guess, relatively small samples, which makes things quite complicated, because if you want to do these things properly, you're going to have a randomized controlled trial, right? With 50 prosopagnosics, 50 control, and matched in all sorts of ways. And then you have to check whether whatever strategies you come up with, the outcomes persist, beyond kind of the experimental session, right? Or, what will happen 3 months down the road and things like that. So yeah, a lot to do there.
Awesome. I know you need to leave. So Pharaoh, do you have any final questions?
Yeah, sorry. Again, a silly one, going back to it. Why would people, and do people, fake having facial blindness just for fun?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I mean, occasionally. I mean, I don't have a good feel in terms of the estimate, but occasionally there are people who, I don't know, they just say like, hey, I have this and that, and they kind of, when you look at their experience and the pattern of responding, when they did the battery, it's suggesting that it's probably, it's not prosopagnosia what we're seeing here. Kind of something else, but it's a small minority. Most people who work with us, they're being genuinely honest. They're just saying, I have trouble with faces in my life, right? So I just want to know whether I fit the criteria. And often what happens is they're actually glad if we say, yeah, your numbers actually check out, and they pass the statistical threshold, because then they have kind of something, they have a name for the condition, because the sad thing often is that if you don't know that you have this, then you often can blame yourself and say, I'm just not attentive, I'm not socially good, maybe I'm not a kind person or something. But actually, no, it's nothing like that. It's just your visual system is a bit unusual. There's some alterations there, but it has nothing to do with you and your motivations and your values. So people are often I wouldn't say happy, but relieved. It's probably the word that, hey, oh, that's good. And then they ask you what strategies are out there for, I can use. Is there any cure? The answer is no, not yet. We have no cure, but we have some strategies, focus on non-facial cues and being upfront, I guess, with people is probably the best, just be honest and say this. And it also helps raise awareness about the condition, right? And also other conditions. Then if you read about aphantasia or dyscalculia and whatever, it's just, every brains are different, right? So I think that's probably the take-home message for all of us here, neuroscientists, like every brain's different. The basic structure is probably the same, the blueprint's there, but there's so much variation, and it's all part of the same world.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you made that very nice. And
okay. Was that the closing?
Because I was gonna go with saying, like, I can answer the question why people might fake it. Example, you're in town and you don't want to talk to that person. But yeah, you just made it really nice. Cool. So, all right. So what we usually do is we ask a bunch of rapid fire questions, but because you have to leave in 2 minutes, I will ask the 3 or 4 ones which I think would be really nice for someone who does visual perception and things. I also have to ask a couple of the basic ones. So first of all, cats or dogs?
Dogs.
If your life were a movie, what genre would it be?
Action.
Nice. What superpower would you like to have?
Time travel.
I'm surprised. You should have gone with being able to read faces really well.
No, I've studied it enough and I don't care about it anymore. Time travel. I'd like to time
travel. If you were an animal, what animal would you like to be?
Ooh. A bird.
I guess for travel again, isn't it? A little bit easy. If there, the last couple. So, do you have a version of there are 2 kinds of people in this world?
Not really. There's more than 2. I think that oversimplifies things.
All right. The final question, which we ask everyone, is if you had to leave all our listeners, everyone, with one piece of advice, what would it be?
Keep listening to Smooth Brain Podcast.
Oh, yes.
Is that good?
That's good. That's fantastic. We obviously need to have you back on to talk about all the things you've done and what you spoke about now in more detail. But
happy to do so.
Time constraints. So yeah, thank you so much, Tirta, for coming on. Thanks, Faro, again for jumping in.
Yeah,
thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, take care.